I never would have met them any other way. I never would have driven a 66 Mustang or a 65 Corvair any other time in my life. You just form such a big bond with everyone. It's like one big family road trip.
This is Kinzie Wilson, and she just completed the Great Race, a grueling endurance competition where old cars and enthusiasts traveled thousands of miles across 9 states. Kinzie was on a team sponsored by the RPM Foundation, along with her teammates Olivia Gadjo, Noah Jackson, and Betty Parrish. And they drove a 1965 Corvair. This team was part of the XCup division of the Great Race, a division, it's important to note, that is made up entirely of high school and college-age students.
RPM is the administrator of the Grants, Scholarships, and Team Choice Award for the XCup division of the Great Race.
This is Nick Ellis, Executive Director of the RPM Foundation.
There's a huge skilled trade shortage that's facing our country, vehicle restoration and preservation in particular. There's not a lot of young people getting into this field. And we want to basically offer as many opportunities as we can to the people who are genuinely passionate about pursuing a career in this field.
This is Fuel for the Future, presented by State Farm Insurance and driven by America's Automotive Trust. I'm Michael May, and today's episode, The Great Race. So, what is the Great Race?
First of all, race is kind of a misnomer. Everybody thinks cannonball run when they hear the Great Race. Great Race is a time, speed, distance rally. Your car has to be, or I'm going to say your vehicle has to be 1974 or older, because we actually had 3 motorcycles in the race this year. But you've got a driver and a navigator team. Each morning you receive a set of instructions, and you need to follow those instructions absolutely perfectly to the letter. Can't use GPS. You have to navigate strictly old school. If you follow those instructions perfectly, you'll hit a series of checkpoints at the exact second that you're meant to. That is, the instructions will tell you, go 35 miles per hour down this road until you see this sign, then turn left, go 45 miles per hour. So if you think about that for a second, that's assuming that your car will go from 35 to 0 immediately, and then 0 back up to 45 immediately. The navigator actually has to calculate how long it's going to take your car to slow down to 0, make that turn, and then accelerate to 45. So there's a ton of calculations and math involved in this. There's synchronicity between the driver and the navigator. It's a terrific team building exercise. So I can't think of a better way to introduce a young person into this than to involve them in the Great Race.
And so then I was like, okay, so what exactly are we doing? I didn't really know. There was a few training sessions, but it's such a complex idea to wrap your head around, especially as a navigator, because there's so much. You have to follow the instructions, and you have to tell the driver, and there's a certain language you have to use, and all the pictures and the words on the instructions are kind of complicated.
What got you interested in cars and driving and that kind of stuff?
My dad really wanted a boy, and he got me. So I got to go along to all the car shows, and there was a local drag strip literally 2 minutes down the road. And my dad's just a really big car guy, so he would have me help him fix the cars or just do little maintenance stuff here and there. And I was like, I actually kind of like this, I think. And then one day I was 13, and his friend brought over a Corvette, and he was like, "You want it?" And I was like, I'm 13. What am I gonna do with it? Yeah, it's gorgeous, but what am I gonna do with it? It's just gonna sit there and tease me for the next 3 years until I can actually drive it? And my dad was like, "Well, the drag strip down the road just opened up a new category. It's called Junior Street, and you could actually race this right now." So I was like,
Oh my God.
"Well, okay." I never thought about me driving, especially at 13. So I was
Yeah.
like, "Okay, let's try it." So I actually bought the car with my own money when I was 13 years old, and I was in love. So it just kinda grew from there. I've tried a
Yeah.
bunch of different types of racing, and I actually ended up going to school for my undergrad for motorsport management, which is like a business degree in motorsports.
If you had your ideal dream job around cars, what would that be?
Something within F1. I love Formula One. I like the fact that it travels the world and it's very immersive. You get to see every bit of the world, the good, the bad, the ugly, like, it's I just love it, and, tracks are different every time you go, and it's so fast-paced, like, there's new drivers and new teams, and I love all the change, and that I don't know exactly where in Formula One I wanna be, but I know it's in Formula One somewhere.
This was Kinzie Wilson's second year with the RPM team. Last year, she was a navigator, and this year, a driver. Now, she is not unique in her pursuits. A lot of the other participants in the XCup division, including her teammates, are working hard to achieve their dreams in various automotive fields. But before we go any further, as someone who loves history, I think it's important to know more about how the Great Race came to be. The current iteration has hundreds of entrants, 5 different divisions, awards, cash prizes, and it's been going on for over 30 years. But you can trace its origins back a very long time.
Great Race actually began 115 years ago with the original Great Race, which was from New York to Paris.
This is Jeff Mahl. He's one of the main supporters and masterminds behind the XCup division of the Great Race.
I guess that you could say that Great Race was in my genes, certainly in the lineage of my great-grandfather who won the very first Great Race. His record in that Great Race has not been equaled in over 115 years. He's held the record for off-road. In his case, there were no roads in 1908. Automotive endurance racing, and he is now in the Automotive Hall of Fame in Detroit, right next to Henry Ford and Ransom Olds, who said that New York to Paris race in 1908 was impossible.
It's exciting to meet somebody like Jeff Mahl because the first thing I think of when I hear Great Race is the 1908 race from New York to Paris. It was the first, and still only, around-the-world endurance race with automobiles. And think for a moment, even if you don't know a lot about cars, what automotive technology was like in 1908. And think about the roads at the time. In fact, there were only a few hundred miles of paved roads in the entire country. These events and the historic 1907 Peking to Paris race were competitions that pitted drivers and mechanics and manufacturers and countries all against each other using this still new technology that was changing the world: cars. That 1908 race was won by the American team in a Thomas Flyer, driven primarily by George Schuster, who, as we've said, is Jeff Mahl's great-grandfather. Long-distance competitions are part of the tradition of automobiles, and they continue today to inspire the next generation. Here's more from Jeff Mahl.
Today's Great Race is a modern version of that race, has crisscrossed the United States, covering every state in the Union. The XCup division is comprised of high school and college teams from throughout the U.S. This year, 2023, we had a total of 8 teams, and that variety of young people is what the XCup division is all about.
And what's unique about the XCup, in your opinion, in terms of what the students are receiving for participating?
XCup is a little different than most approaches to engaging youth in the classic car hobby. We're firm believers in giving them hands-on experience outside of a classroom and what many of us as adults would consider bucket list experiences. The XCup students are a bit different than the adult divisions. The adult divisions carry with it first prize in the grand champion class of $50,000. So this is a major competition. We felt it important that since the youth do not win cash awards, cash prizes, that we do 2 things. First, we make it affordable for young teams. Great Race has been extremely supportive in waiving the entry fee for the XCup teams. We have teamed up with RPM Foundation with the umbrella of the American Automotive Trust, and we award each of these young teams a $2,500 grant that the faculty advisor can use to cover expenses associated with the race. At the end of the race, the teams are awarded scholarships. And the interesting thing about XCup scholarships is that the qualification includes a requirement for advanced education in an automotive related field. Now, that can be at a trade school, that can be at a 2-year program, a 4-year program, as long as the training or education has an automotive component. Those scholarships are awarded to the teams in the order of their finish. So the competitive aspect is very, very much maintained. And in many cases, these young people are able to pursue their higher education as a result of the support of these scholarships.
And here's Nick Ellis of the RPM Foundation again.
We started out as a grant giving organization about 18 years ago. And over the years, we've added outreach programs and most recently an apprenticeship program to our repertoire of ways of helping young people get involved in the industry.
So you mentioned that there's a shortage of these skilled workers in this field.
Yeah.
What do you think is the generational difference with the younger generations right now growing up? Why are they less interested in these skilled and, specifically speaking, automotive kind of tracks?
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that question. I don't think it's a generational difference so much as it is the push starting in the 70s and 80s for all people to pursue a 4-year college career. That push resulted in the sidelining of the skilled trades.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much a lack of interest. I think it's a lack of opportunity. I think that there are not enough opportunities being put in front of young people to get involved in this. When you talk with young people, even ones that are in an automotive technology or collision repair program, and you float the idea of actually working on classic cars, they kind of light up like they've never even considered that this is a possibility. So I hear a lot of people who want to kind of slam the next generation saying, nobody wants to work anymore. They're not interested in cars. We can't get them off their phones. I reject that. I think that that's on us. That's on the generation that came before to enlighten and encourage this generation to take part in what we find to be so valuable.
Are you involved with all the XCup teams or just a few?
We do the recruiting for the XCup teams. So new XCup teams that come in, we help them get acclimated to what the rules are for the XCup. We help them come up with fundraising strategies because even though that entry fee is waived, even though you receive the $2,500 in grant funding, the actual expenses are actually quite a bit higher. To put things in perspective, I think our individual RPM XCup team, I think we ended up at about $18,000 to run that team. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with last year's team because we had a great presence, this team from last year's team. So last year, we really wanted to do something different. We had an all-female team in the race, and they drove a 1966 Mustang that was borrowed from LeMay America's Car Museum in Tacoma, Washington. And that team had two young navigators, Kinzie Wilson and Olivia Gadjo. This year, Kinzie and Olivia both came back as drivers for our team, and we got two new navigators, Noah Jackson and Betty Parrish. Noah and Betty, I believe, are both 17 years old. So we had a really young team.
By the end of last year's great race, I was like, wow, that was the coolest thing I have ever done. And I didn't know going into it how cool it was actually going to be. So this year, I was so excited because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm coming back again as a driver. Like, I was super excited to drive. It was a new route, new team. I was like, this is gonna be awesome. And it was, of course. It's always so much fun.
Kinsey, tell me about the start of the race, and then what's it like to actually participate? What are you doing during the race?
Yeah, so the start this year was in St. Augustine, Florida. So basically, everyone starts in one location and it's like a big car show. So there's a bunch of people there. They have the announcers announcing each car as they take off, like who's driving, who's navigating, the story behind the car, what car they're in, stuff like that. So then you get out and you have to go through all the crowds to actually get to the starting point. We have to do a calibration run because you have a speedometer given to you by the Great Race so that everyone's on the
Okay.
same system. It's called a time wise. So you have to calibrate your time wise to your car every day. So then you have a start time. And as soon as you start, you're on. Like there's stoplights, stop signs, turns, so many different types of instructions. You have to go a certain speed for a certain amount of time and then speed up, and that's what I'm saying, you have to, like, calculate all the speeds lost and gained and, like, figure out the time and stuff like that. Because as you go throughout the day, there's different checkpoints that you hit. So once you hit a checkpoint, that time is that time, it doesn't change. And then once you get to the finish line, that's when you get your times, and if you got a perfect time on any of the legs, you got an ace. So those are really hard to come by, and a lot of teams that have done it for multiple years never get an ace, and we got 5. So it was
Yeah.
really awesome. Like, our navigators killed it. Like, I was super excited to drive. It was just like dive in head first and figure it out.
As a navigator last year, your first time out, part of me would think that that's the harder job between the 2. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, definitely there's so much math because you have to figure out like the time lost between stops and turns, or if you get held up by a train, you have to figure all that out on the go. And then trying to figure out the next instruction and making sure your driver remembers it and that you're communicating clearly. Like I thought I was going to come as a driver and be like, "Oh, this is going to be so easy. They're just going to tell me what to do." But
Yeah, yeah.
then hearing instructions and executing it and remembering, like, we were on a lot of country roads that went for miles. Like, it would be 30 minutes in between instructions. So, both parts are definitely hard, but I think the navigation part definitely has more, like, math and solving and, like, you use your brain more,
Mhm.
definitely. And normally there's one driver and one navigator. So if it's like you and your best friend and y'all want to do it, y'all can go out in your car and practice and then be set for the great race. The RPM Foundation team is a little bit different. We got our car loaned to us from someone in California who saw the New York Times article from last year's great race. And he was like, "Hey, this is really cool. Do you want me to use my car?" And of course, we're like, yes, thank you." So then on the team aspect side of it, you can have more than one driver and one navigator. So we actually had two drivers and two navigators. I was a driver from Texas. Our other driver was from New York. One of our navigators is from Florida, and the other one was from Tennessee.
What did you think of the Corvair?
I had never even heard of a 65 Corvair. I was like, "What is that?" And then I saw it in person. I was like, "This is kind of cool." And then everyone, like, we were telling everyone what car we were in, and there was a 50-50, "Oh my gosh, you're gonna love it," or "Oh my gosh, you're gonna hate it" reaction. And I was like, "Okay, well, I don't know what is going on, so I'm just gonna figure it out." And I loved it. Like, it handled so good. We had no problems for such a, like, small car, and, like, I understood what they were saying about you're gonna hate it, like, the engine's in the
Yeah.
back, this, that, and the other. It did so well, like, it was the perfect car for the race, and we had so much fun with it.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've always been a fan of Corvairs, and they do get a bad rap. And so
Yeah.
I find it really awesome that you were getting about a 50-50 because that's kind of what I would expect of people saying you're gonna love it or hate it.
Like I said, I had never heard of them, and, like, once I saw it, I was like, "Oh, that's kinda cute." And
Yeah.
then, like, we drove it, and I was like, "Whoa, this car knows, like, how to handle." And then at every single stop, people were, like, crowding us, and I was like, "Is something wrong with our car?" And they're like, "Oh my gosh, you're in a Corvair." Like, they were so excited to see a Corvair in the Great Race. It was so cool, like, people were coming to the stops just to see our car. I was like, "Whoa." this is like a secret club. Like, this is cool.
What was the end of the race like for your team?
We did a lot better, I think, than we expected. The end of the race was a little tricky because it was in Colorado, so the altitude's different, and the car didn't like the hills with that altitude, so holding speed was really tricky, but for the most part, we did really, really good. But then we crossed the finish line and, like, Noah's parents surprised him, and it was just so cool, like, Olivia's parents were there. My dad was with us for the beginning of the race, so it was cool, like, seeing everyone and, like, coming together and, like, "We did it."
Would you suggest this experience to anybody else that's growing up in their, late teens, early 20s, looking at a future in automotives, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I would 100% recommend it. The only downside was that we had hot dogs, a lot, because at all the stops, it's just an easy thing to feed however many people, but that's, like, the only downside. You really form a bond and you get to know, like, who the people are that you're in a car with for 8 plus hours a day. It's so hard to explain the Great Race, like, what it is, how it works, like, all the things that you take out of it, but like I said, I went into it totally blind, and I came out like a whole new person. I was like, "That was the coolest thing ever." But, yeah, I mean and the RPM Foundation is great, like, Nick especially was there this year, he was there the whole way, which was really, really cool for us because last year he went up until a certain point, and then he met us at the finish line.
Uh,
But it was so cool, like, for him to be there every single day and, like, us getting to tell him, "This is what we saw today. This is, like, what we did, how we did." Like, it was just so cool seeing him at every finish line, and he had the biggest smile, like, watching us cross the finish line. I was like, "Oh, we made him proud." Like, it was just awesome.
and here's Nick.
This is probably my favorite story of the whole thing. When we stopped in Wichita, Kansas, that day it hit 108 degrees. I felt so bad for these team members. We had all four of them in the car at all times. They roll into Wichita, Kansas, and one of the things you have to do, you get your times for that day. And if you disagree with any of the timekeeping, you have to go and dispute it right away.
Mm.
So I kind of expected them to roll into town and just spill out of the car in a lump and just, drink a bunch of fluids. Well, they immediately were running to challenge their time. Well, right at the same time, this gentleman had come up and introduced himself, and he was from the Mid-Continent Corvair Club. He was the vice president of the Mid-Continent Corvair Club. He had seen on social media that somebody had posted a picture of our Corvair in the race. And he said, "Oh, they're going to Wichita next. I'll go and meet them there." So I felt kind of bad because it was like, hey guys, my name's Bill. I'm with the Mid-Continent. And they're like, "Yeah, great. Nice to meet you. We got to go." And they all run to challenge their times. Well, so I'm there and I'm making small talk with them. And when they come back, I introduce them to Bill, and he asked them, "How's the Corvair running?" And they said, "Really good. But when you hit the brakes, it pulls a little to one side." And I said, "Well, I think it might be one of the brake hoses is getting swollen with the heat."
Uh,
And he said, "Well, I've got spare brake hoses. Do you guys need some help changing them?" And we said, "Sure." And so at 10 o'clock at night in the hotel parking lot, this 1964 Corvair convertible pulls up, and a couple other pickup trucks pull up, and all these guys from the Corvair Club pop out of their cars and help us with changing out the brake hoses. And again, I was very specific. I want to make sure that the kids are the ones doing the hands-on work. So they just kind of stood by and directed them on how to do it correctly. They showed them how to pull the brake drums off and adjust the brakes. And we got that car back together and running at probably 1 o'clock in the morning. And, these guys thought that or really just Bill thought that he was going to come by and just kind of say hi to us and, and kind of send us on our way. And instead he ended up there for like 5 or 6 hours helping us with the car. And when I talk about what the foundation does and what we're trying to achieve in bringing the next generation into this industry, but also into the culture, That's what I'm hoping we can sustain. That's the spirit of somebody just really loving this car. And, he could have said, well, that's tough. I'm going to go home and watch TV and put my feet up. But he not only came out to help us, but he got a whole group of his friends to come out and help us too.
The rally's over. Obviously, next year is going to come up very quick. But again, what are your goals with the RPM Foundation and youth? What are you hoping that this event and more that you can work on can do to encourage younger people to get involved with mechanics,
Well,
automobiles?
specific to the Great Race, the goal for the XCup is to increase participation to 10 XCup teams. And we've seen great growth. Last year, we had 4 XCup teams. This year, we had 8. So ideally, I'd really like to get us to a point where there's actually a waiting list to get into the XCup. And in that way, it becomes kind of a prestigious thing to have an XCup team in the race. In order to do that, we're going to need to increase fundraising. With 10 teams, that's $25,000 in grants that need to be given. We also give scholarships to automotive and mechanical engineering students that are on those teams. So we want to be able to give a relative amount of scholarships that's appropriate for those amount of teams. And then, of course, we still have the Team Choice Award. So more teams, more fundraising to support those teams for the XCup. In general, for RPM, I mentioned that we've always been a grant-giving organization, and we've kind of branched out into doing these outreach programs, and most recently the apprenticeship program. So where we're trying to make a difference here is we're putting together this curriculum for shops to offer to apprentices, so that when students come out of a really competent high school automotive technology or collision repair program, instead of going to a post-secondary, they can go directly into an apprenticeship at one of these shops. And instead of paying money to learn these concepts, they're actually earning. And RPM can be there with supportive services and grants to assist them through that educational process. So that's where I really see RPM having a significant impact in the next few years.
I'd love to ask you about the scholarships that you provide to the team members. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So each team is given the opportunity for their individual members to apply for scholarship funding. And it's specific to automotive and mechanical engineering. So if you have an interest in those fields and you're on an XCup team, you can apply to us for funding. And the way we do that is wherever your team places in the rankings overall is how those scholarships are given out. So the highest placed team will have the largest share of the scholarship funding. So there's incentive to perform well within the XCup. But really the only requirement is that you finish. So if you have to push that car over the finish line, your team members, any of the team members who applied for scholarship funding will receive scholarship funding.
Nice. And describe what the Team Choice Award is.
Yeah, so I like this. This is Jeff Mahl's brainchild, and I just really love it. This award is really for whichever team embodies the spirit of the XCup. There is that spirit of helpfulness and camaraderie. So the XCup teams, because a lot of them are mechanical students, automotive students, when other cars are having issues, a lot of times you'll see an XCup team there helping those teams get their car back on the road. We look at which of those teams has really participated the most in helping the other teams and really representing the XCup division the best. And whichever organization is behind that team receives the $1,000 XCup Team Choice Award.
Who won it this year?
It was the Early Ford V8 Foundation Museum.
Cool.
This is Craig Floyd and his team. Craig Floyd is the president of the board for the Early Ford V8 Foundation. He and that team did so much to make sure that the other teams were prepared for this. They actually had several of the cars shipped to their museum in Auburn, Indiana, so they could do a run through on the cars, install the time-wise speedometers, make sure that they're in good running condition for the race. They did that for the RPM car as well. In addition to that, there was a team that didn't have a car, and they loaned that team a 1950 Ford so that they could participate in the race. So that's, a great indication of what the Team Choice Award is all about. Who out there is making sure that the other teams are successful in addition to their own.
Great, great. Is there anything you would like to add? Any final thoughts or an interesting story from the rally that you didn't get to talk about?
There actually is.
Yeah.
I keep talking about how the race is really about camaraderie and team building. And our team finished in Colorado Springs. The race finished in Colorado Springs. So the plan was the day after the finish of the race for everybody to fly back home. And what I did was I drove the Corvair from Colorado Springs to Tacoma, Washington, so it can be displayed at the LeMay America's Car Museum. So it was Monday morning of last week when I'm, making sure that the team is ready and about to get on the way to their flights. And two of our different team members, Noah's mother and sister, came out to cheer him on at the finish line. And Olivia's mother and father came to encourage her at the finish line. So I'm in the lobby of the hotel and I'm making sure everybody's, on their way getting to the airport. And they come up to me and they said, "Hey, we're actually going to stay a couple extra days." That was the best part of the whole thing to me, that these young people who had never met before wanted to spend more time together after the race was done. They weren't ready to say goodbye.
Listening and learning about this event, it's evident that this team valued the experience above winning. It's a very inspiring group, and I wanted to know more about Kinzie's future plans and how RPM, XCup, and all of her experiences may help her. Are you done with your undergrad?
Done with my undergrad, getting my master's in Italy.
So tell me about that.
Yeah, so I leave next Saturday. I found a program at the Bologna Business School. They have a global MBA for supercars, superbikes, and motorsports. But I remember one of the questions they asked me in my interview was, you're kind of young and you're going to be working in group settings with people who have more experience than you. How are you going to handle that? I was like, well, I know I'm young, I'm also a female, and I'm also American, so I've got a lot of things going against me that could also be advantages. I've had to prove myself up until this point, and I'm gonna have to keep doing that in the world of motorsports as a woman. So I'm not scared of the obstacles. I want the challenge. And so I got accepted, and now I leave in literally less than 2 weeks, and I start in September.
I can't help but reflect on the power of passion and how it transcends generations. In an era where many of our children are growing up amidst a digital revolution, taking Ubers, working remotely, these participants of the XCup division, despite their distinctive paths, they share something universal, something we can all relate to: passion. Whether it's for mechanics or artificial intelligence, passion drives innovation, progress, and ultimately shapes the future. The RPM Foundation is more than just an organization aiding these students on their journey through the Great Race. It helps support younger generations explore, innovate, and carry forth a legacy. This has been Fuel for the Future, presented by State Farm and driven by America's Automotive Trust. Learn more at americasautomotivetrust.org. And I encourage you all to follow the show on your favorite listening apps, and if you can, rate and leave a review. Learn how to get involved with the Great Race and the XCup division at greatrace.com. More information will be provided in the show notes. Additionally, our next episode is a follow-up with Jeff Mahl, where I got to discuss in way more detail the crazy, sensational, and dramatic 1908 Great Race from New York to Paris. It is worth a listen. Thank you all very much. I'm Michael May, and a special thank you to Nick Ellis, Kinzie Wilson, Jeff Mahl, and everyone at AAT.